Hi, Cory.
Yep, I'm here. Hey.
Great. Yeah.
All right. Would you like me to start or?
I am actually going to introduce you as soon as,
All
oh, there,
right.
we're both up. And I was going to introduce you the traditional way, but I had this intuition just before we got on that I was going to introduce you via something I wrote based on our podcast. So, because this convergence is about the stories we tell, and we're all storytellers, you're a great storyteller, Cory. Love how you connect ancient wisdom with, stories that we don't know, and also all the literature you read. But Brenda Davis, Cory Davis's mother, is one of the leading plant-based um, dietitians in the world. And I think that she was very paramount in changing the Canada Food Guide. And after I interviewed Cory and Brenda, I wrote on the podcast. So if anyone listening would like to be interviewed on the Million Vegan Gamblers podcast, please contact me because that's what it's about. It's basically we're just telling a story. We're telling a story about what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now, as they say in many 12-step groups. So I'm going to introduce Cory based on a story I wrote and that my beloved partner Paul Papin edited. And thank you, Cory. So this is a story about when Cory was a little boy. And it's called It Has Eyes, Mummy. Does the child know the burger he is eating had eyes? Does the child know the burger cuddled with its mama too and loved to feel the sun and grass as we do? This is a story, a true story. Once upon a time, there was a father, a mother, and a child. When the child was only 1 year old, the mother said to the father, I want to begin eating vegetarian. The father had been raised behind the northern Canadian Shield, among the forest where the loud reports of hunters rang out, and the lakes where sports fishermen sat for hours in deadly silence. And yet somehow, above that noise and beneath that silence, the father had long ago heard the calling from the living land that gave them so much. And so he replied to his wife, I thought you would never ask. The father loved the natural world, the stroke and drip of his paddle, the lonely echoes of the loon's call, the silhouette of the distant moose gliding half submerged through the water. Above all, he loved sharing it all with his son he'd been blessed with, so that the boy, too, would grow into the most gentle of men, which is Cory. But before this happened, when the boy was only 3, he was invited to a birthday party. His mother felt it was time to tell him, Son, the burgers we eat are not the same as most other people eat. Ours are made from beans and rice and vegetables. Theirs are made from cows. The boy gasped, shocked and bewildered. But Mummy, they have eyes. These words of his would be told and retold, first among his family and then shared out into the world. But all children have eyes to see if we let them, as do the fish of the northern waters, because how else would they see the lure? As do the birds hunters shoot mid-flight, the grouse and geese, although their eyes aren't quick enough to see the shot before they close forever and drop from the sky. David Suzuki says, if a child is to keep their innate wonder of nature alive, they must have one adult who helps them continue to connect. This lucky boy had 2, a father and a student of wondrous nature, and a mother and teacher of nutritional wonder. Meanwhile, the boy continued to grow in his veggies and beans, bigger and stronger, but also wiser until he was a man, standing humbly on Indigenous land. He recognized the ones who were there long before him, the ones who had long respected the earth they walked so lightly upon because they never forgot that the earth was them, their mother as well as the mother of all. The man worked with these elders and listened to their teachings. He learned about stewardship how to stand with them and never above, how to speak for and never down to. It wasn't easy to live with eyes and heart open in a disappearing world, where it often looks and feels like there will soon be no place left for our grandchildren of any species. The man and his mother, though, continue to do this hard work, not just holding space for the future, but expanding it. And for their work, we in the present, as well as those in the future, are so very grateful. So here's Cory. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you so much, Tammy. That is absolutely beautiful. I really appreciate that thoughtful poem you wrote. This presentation, by the way, Reconciling with the Past, can everybody see my screen? Was inspired with from Tammy and her podcast on the Million Vegan Grandmothers with her thought-provoking dialogue, which continues to motivate me today. So thank you, Tammy. Be sure to check out my book, Plant Powered Protein, co-authored with two of my lifelong heroes, Vicente Molina and my mother, Brenda Davis. But before we dig in to Reconciling with the Past, a little bit about me. I'm an agrologist with a career forged in natural resource management and environmental conservation, from forestry, agriculture, land use planning, natural disaster management, mining, and I'm a nature enthusiast. Prior to my professional career, I taught canoeing lessons, led interpretive hiking tours, and I've been an activist from a very early age as a member of the Compassion for Animals road expedition, the Care Tour in 2003 and 2004, where we traveled to over 100 cities, 39 states, where I gave ethical, environmentally friendly cooking demos, led discussion groups, spread the message. As a teenager and young adult, I was passionate about social justice, animal rights, and the environment. And now I'm focused on agriculture, the social, cultural, and ecological costs of our food system. I'm part of the Canadian plant-based cities movement as well. Support them if you can, join. Agriculture is part of and profoundly alters the nature of ecologies. It results in trade-offs. By changing the function of an ecosystem, we produce certain benefits at the expense of ecological services that habitat would otherwise provide, for better or for worse. And today I'm zooming into you from the Comox Valley. Comox is derived from the word Comukthe, Coast Salish for the land of plenty, the traditional territory of Comox First Nation on what we now call Vancouver Island, where I live as an uninvited guest and presume the privilege to establish a life here, benefit from its land and resources, participate in community, and build a sense of place, a place where colonial oppression is so visible. It's even in its name, Vancouver Island, named after Captain George Vancouver, born in England, who was responsible for securing the lands of Western Vancouver Island for the English through negotiations with the Spanish. I think it's important to acknowledge the painful colonial legacy of our past and the nations who stewarded this land for millennia prior to our occupation. Jody Wilson-Raybould, in her book, True Reconciliation, defines reconciliation as a process of learning, understanding, and action. The historical element is central to understanding our impact on people and the landscapes we've altered. And I'm troubled by the narrow focus of our environmental discourse, which often prioritizes economics and science while neglecting the human experience. While data and science are vital for grounding us in reality, it seems like our sense of belonging in nature, community, is overlooked or deemed irrelevant. It's as if the objectives of natural resource and environmental management are divorced from history, human connection, psychology, and social justice. And personally, I refuse to accept this disconnection. The Rig Veda, a Hinduist text dated back to around 1400 BCE, conveys a clear message that the environment belongs to all living beings and must be protected by all. It speaks of water akin to our nurturing mother, deserving protection in every manifestation and location, shielded from pollution and safeguarded from contamination. To taint it would be to mar an invaluable essence, akin to destroying our cherished maternal source. wisdom of the ages. The BC Assembly of First Nations called water the blood of Mother Earth. I mean, what a beautiful perspective. And how did this philosophy that existed on the land change so dramatically? Well, it changed in many ways, and I'll touch on that and more. And to do this, I'll take you on a little bit of a journey to the past, how human activity, in particular the exploitation of animals, shaped the North American landscape we find ourselves in today and altered watersheds, ecologies, and cultures in profound ways. I'll begin the story in the British Isles. You see, by the 1600s, Europeans in this area exploited to extinction the Eurasian elk, the brown bear, gray whale, lynx, reindeer, wild boar, numerous birds, amphibians, reptiles, insects like the large copper butterfly, and the Eurasian beaver, gray wolves by the 1700s. These extinctions were largely caused by overhunting and extensive land use change. For example, wolves, lynxes, and bears were persecuted and hunted to extinction, while deforestation, habitat fragmentation, and land use change altered populations of their prey. They were persecuted in part to pay tribute to kings and nobles as trophies. Killing a predator is a sign of masculinity, perhaps toxic masculinity. These creatures were also considered a danger to people and centrally a threat to the expanding livestock sector, in which they were not compatible with, as the figure on the right-hand side of this slide suggests, who occupy, by the way, 40% of the total habitable land surface of our planet. Of course, apex predators like wolves, they're critical keystone species, which means that they're animals that play a disproportionately large role in ecosystem dynamics. The impacts of apex predators on the land can be characterized by trophic cascades, which is an ecological phenomenon triggered by the addition or removal of predators. A very basic trophic cascade model would be something like you remove the wolf, deer populations increase, resulting in overgrazing the landscape. However, the reality is much more deep and complex. The picture above shows a scenario where apex predators are removed and it results in increased stream bank erosion, less plant biomass, a more simplified plant community, fewer songbird species, among other changes. But there's so much more to learn here. Only now are we learning more deeply about the far-reaching extent to which trophic cascades influence ecosystem function. Recent research suggests that these trophic cascades have impacts on the dynamics of disease, wildfire, carbon sequestration, invasive species, nutrient cycling, the biogeochemical exchanges in soils, water, and air. And I like the way this paper puts it, trophic downgrading of planet Earth. Until recently, large apex consumers were ubiquitous across the globe and had been for millions of years. The loss of these animals may be humankind's most pervasive influence on nature. What they don't note is that now livestock is virtually ubiquitous across the globe, whose management requires the control of apex predator populations. We hear a lot about species extinction, but there's something so much deeper veiled behind the extinction crisis, waiting for the world to understand. As Daniel Jansen said, what escapes the eye is a much more insidious kind of extinction, the extinction of ecological interactions. Again, apex predators are keystone species, and the beaver is also a keystone species because of its significant influence on the environment. In the British Isles, however, they became extinct in the 1500s due to increased hunting pressures to extract fur, meat, and castoreum. Castoreum's a secretion used in perfumes, food, and medicine. Across the Atlantic, however, in Turtle Island, what we now call North America, indigenous people here had no idea this was happening, that such profoundly dangerous human-induced ecological change was occurring on the other side of the world. They were also not aware that ideas, philosophies, culture, technology, disease, antibodies were being transmitted across vast distances between Europe and Asia. As wildlife resources were becoming scarce in the British Isles. Meanwhile, in Turtle Island, Spanish settlers brought in diseases that were foreign to the New World, as people and animals here were previously disconnected from Eurasia for thousands of years. And this resulted in a 90% decline in the indigenous population, death by disease, a strong, vibrant population of tens of millions who were hunting, prescribed burning land, diminished. These human pressures on the landscape thus also dropped substantially, and the wildlife and vegetation rebounded dramatically. And for indigenous survivors, they were living in a post-apocalyptic landscape. Communities wiped out, social and governance structures shattered, trade, intertribal relations unduly altered. And this temporary societal and ecological transformation created a false idea in the minds of Europeans about Turtle Island, its inhabitants, and the abundance of wildlife resources available. At a time when wildlife resources were overexploited and scarce in the British Isles, North America offered those resources in profound and perhaps even artificial abundance. And this, in part, paved the way for the disturbing bloodbath that would ensue as billions of animals would meet their end to old world settlers over the next couple hundred years. Millions of bears, wolves, moose, pronghorns, elk, deer, bison, birds, and all kinds of wildlife would be slaughtered every year, sometimes for no good reason, but mostly for economic incentive. As historian Richard White would put it, North America would go from a biological republic, a place where animals and humans were philosophically equal. For example, there was many indigenous themes of wildlife pitying humans and wolves having noble human characteristics. It would go from this biological republic to a biological monarchy where anything that got in our way or had economic value was murdered, exploited, God-given for our sole use. In fact, upon arriving in North America, settlers often depicted wolves as cowardly, not the noble qualities attributed to them in earlier accounts. This perception stemmed from their avoidance of human contact rather than any aggressive behavior. Unlike the fierce creatures of werewolf tales ingrained in European folklore, these animals were not inclined to attack humans. Yet the cultural stereotype endures still, echoing through time, perpetuating attitudes towards wolves even today. Settlers also saw wolves as competition for game. They would say things like, imagine how abundant the deer and elk would be, a resource we could exploit if only there were no more wolves. It would be a hunter's paradise. They also saw predators such as wolves as a threat to their livestock, their economic assets. And much like in the old world, poison traps, government programs to exterminate wolves, and the right to protect their livestock from the natural world would follow. There was sort of an unwritten law of the range that no rancher would knowingly pass by a carcass of any kind without inserting in it a large dose of strychnine sulfate in hope of killing one more wolf. Young, 1946. Goldman, a biologist with the Bureau of Biological Surveys, said that large predatory mammals destructive of livestock and game no longer have a place in our advancing civilization. And studies today indeed consistently reveal deeply ingrained biases in livestock producers, especially against wolves and other large predators, often even independent of their own personal experience. It's a real shameful circumstance that predators are considered as financial liabilities to those raising livestock. And thus, to this day, the industry prominently lobbies and campaigns to protect their animals from nature by killing wildlife regularly, wolves and cougars, black bears and grizzly bears. In fact, in 2021, the US Department of Agricultural Wildlife Service killed over 400,000 native animals, largely to protect the livestock sector, including 324 gray wolves, over 64,000 coyotes, 433 black bears, 200 mountain lions, 600 bobcats, over 3,000 foxes, and almost 25,000 beavers, and 1,714 river otters. In response to this report, Colette Adkins from the Center of Biological Diversity said, "It's inexcusable that wildlife services continue to target rare and ecologically important animals like wolves and grizzly bears, forcing them to suffer and die in cruel traps and snares. Taxpayer-funded wildlife slaughter needs to stop." But wildlife slaughter makes livestock production safe. It's a necessary action for supply chain efficiency. As Johan Dutoit said, on the rangelands, the livestock-wildlife interface is characterized by management actions aimed at controlling problems associated with competition, disease, and depredation. They kill predators so they don't lose money from the loss of livestock to nature. But it's not just predators that succumb to this bloodbath. They target wild herbivores as well, like bison, elk, deer, and typically for two reasons. First, herbivores often compete with livestock for forage. And second, there's a perceived risk of disease transmission from wildlife to cattle, diseases like bovine tuberculosis carried by wild elk or brucellosis in bison, both diseases that were introduced from European cattle to wildlife in North America in the first place. This is an ecological disaster. As the Center for Biological Diversity puts it, from grazing animals to predators, native species are frequently killed to protect meat production profits. Grass-eating species such as elk, deer, and pronghorn have been killed en masse to reserve more feed for cattle. Important habitat-creating animals such as beavers and prairie dogs have been decimated because they disrupt the homogeneous landscapes desired by livestock managers, even beavers. And of course, we need heterogeneity in the landscape to accommodate biodiversity. We need diversity in habitat to accommodate diversity in species. And their efforts to domesticate the North American landscape, and indeed the world, by taking the wildness out to create a safe, productive space for rearing livestock, we're replacing wildlife with livestock at a staggering rate. 96% of all land and marine mammals, for example, are people and livestock, only 4% wild mammals. 10,000 years ago, it was the opposite. 4% people, 96% wildlife. Our gluttonous appetite for flesh and gore has squandered away this biodiverse gift we were blessed with. But that did not stop the self-proclaimed guardians of the grasslands, the BC Cattlemen's Association, from citing predators, treaties, and water as their top concern. And we talked about predators and the disturbing relationship we have with wildlife on the livestock-wildlife interface. But treaties, that's governments making agreements with Indigenous nations to build trust-based relationships by collaboratively developing a framework for living together and sharing the land Indigenous people traditionally occupied, a concern indeed for those with a monopoly on the grasslands. And they also cited water as a concern. Water. Let's talk about water. I think we've all felt and noticed the pressures of drought, where broadly speaking, wildfires and water scarcity impact our lives, sense of place, air we breathe, well-being, and sense of security. Indeed, North America was once a much more water-rich world, and this was in part thanks to the American beaver. You see, the beavers are incredible ecosystem engineers. Their dams once covered Turtle Island, creating vast, epic wetland landscapes. These wetlands, in addition to fostering a sanctuary for wildlife, harbored vast reservoirs of water. As fresh water meandered through our precious creeks and rivers, beavers would capture it onto the land. North American drainage systems and the wildlife therein adapted to the landscapes beavers engineered, superior habitats. But The beaver pelt was once relentlessly sought after for making hats that wouldn't lose their shape after getting wet. In the 1600s, the hunt for beaver pelts really rose in the Americas rapidly after becoming scarce in Europe. And by 1820, the North American beaver was in danger of extinction. But due to a shift in fashion, the innovation of silk, the beaver was saved by a declining demand and a growing beaver conservation movement. But the damage was already done. Beavers who had built and maintained wetlands storing vast amounts of water on the land were nearly gone, and the water-saving systems they once maintained failed. And this depleted North America of much of its freshwater supply. It changed the dynamic of rivers and streams. Water that would be held on land was fast-tracked to the ocean, draining the lands dry, eroding stream banks, and thus removing much of the beautiful wildlife habitat that existed previously. And we built our infrastructure in this new landscape, roads in particular. As beaver populations increased, they were seen as pests, a threat to our infrastructure. I was working as an engineering assistant on resource roads in 2012, dirt roads built for natural resource extraction, when a beaver made use of a culvert on one of our roads to build a wetland. It flooded the road, of course. I campaigned that we should put steel mesh screens on our culverts to prevent this, but in the end, the powers that be thought it too expensive. It was cheaper to hire a hunter to kill the beaver. At this time in the area, there was a beaver cull, $25 a pelt for similar reasons. But we don't just cull beavers for fur and to protect infrastructure. As Glenn Elzinga, a rancher himself, reported, a lot of ranchers see beavers as a rival for water and causing problems, so they hate them. So in this new wetland-deprived landscape, where is our water going? Well, agriculture is by far the largest consumer of water in Canada, representing almost half of all the water consumed over this period. Households less than 10%, mining 4%, oil and gas 7.5%. For agriculture, this includes both livestock watering and crop production. On average, between 2009 and 2019, crop production, crops grown to feed humans and livestock, channeled 56% of agricultural water use. And livestock watering used the remaining 44% of the water dedicated to agriculture. 44%. Livestock watering is water used for drinking and cleaning the filth of intensive livestock operations, ILOs. Livestock farming is incredibly water intensive. For the other 56% of agricultural water use dedicated to our crops, what are we growing? According to the 2022 Agricultural Water Survey, half of the total water in Canada was used for field crops, 39% forage crops, 7% fruit, and 4% vegetable. When we think of field crops, which use half of our agricultural water, we think barley, corn, potatoes, rapeseed, much of which is grown to feed livestock. The feed industry, a colossus amidst Canada's abundant field crops, harvests a formidable 80% of domestically grown barley, 60% of our corn, and 30% of our wheat, directing them into the insatiable appetite of the Canadian feed manufacturing industry. But in this figure, field crops also includes tame pasture. Now, pastures are areas that livestock graze for forage, like grasses, flowers, and other plants. However, about 1/4 of all pasture in Canada is tame pasture. These are irrigated pastures seeded with non-native grass. And then we have forage crops. That's hay to feed livestock like cattle. And hay is typically grasses, legumes, and flowers rolled up into bales. They need hay when forage isn't readily available, when stubble heights are too low, or in the winter when snow is covering the vegetation. Forage crops, hay, used over 3.5 times more water than vegetable and fruit crops combined in 2022. However, looking back through the records, depending on precipitation levels, can use upwards of 10 times more water than vegetable and fruit crops combined. These numbers, they swing wildly depending on rainfall. And in times of drought, hay crops use a lot more water. They like us to think that cattle, for example, eat only grass and hay crops when they need it. The stories they tell, oftentimes they practice creep feeding, slowly introducing grains into their diet to increase their acceptance of feedlot fare. Cattle, if we combine those used for beef and dairy, are the largest consumer of animal feed in the Canadian livestock industry, more than 2.5 times more than poultry, 46% of the industry's total. This feed that they're feeding pigs and cattle and chicken, these are ultra-processed foods, UPF, with added vitamins, minerals, anti-caking agents, flavoring agents, pelleting age, mold inhibitors, acidifiers, antibiotics, and other veterinary health products. Where I live in BC, when cattle reach around 600 to 900 pounds at around 9 to 11 months old, these poor souls are auctioned off in the fall and transported to just a few massive feedlot operations in Alberta. A couple more percent go to Washington State, and there they'll be fed a grain diet, barley rich in Canada, corn rich in the United States, to be brought up to slaughter weight, around 1,400 pounds at around 18 months of age. The pasture diet, mostly grass and hay, only gets them to 600 to 900 pounds. Then over the next 7 to 9 months, they can nearly double their weight, potentially. This quick fattening up process, 2 to 3 pounds a day at these large factory farms, makes the industry economically viable. Then they go to factory slaughterhouse, a putrid hellhole of death, before processing and manufacturing, then to wholesale merchants, before export, where 70% of our pork is exported, or it goes to restaurants or retail. And although 89% of our agricultural subsidies in Canada goes towards the livestock industry, cattle ranching is not all that lucrative. They're often straddling the line of profitability, which is why when faced with proposals that would result in better environmental outcomes, more robust environmental management strategies, it's often met with resistance and strong opposition because it threatens their economic viability, their livelihoods. It's an industry with deep colonial roots in North America and is an industry on a lifeline of public support, one that can be ecologically devastating, changing the land. Let's chat briefly about land use change. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was talking with an Indigenous community about forestry when an elder shared something. He said that the trees speak with the clouds in the sky, telling them to rain, something he was taught as a boy. He was trying to tell me that forests and precipitation are linked. Now, I told some colleagues this, and it was shrugged off quickly. I heard from them what I frequently hear when I share this kind of story with natural resource professionals. Indigenous people, they always say this kind of thing. Darn, I don't think they understood what the elder said. You see, there used to be this paradigm that the removal of forests would increase water availability downstream, as the trees would intercept water that would otherwise be streamlined to our water supply. But that analysis uses a shallow, short-term thinking lens, as forest cover is also related to precipitation. The causal link is evapotranspiration, a process by which plants absorb water through their roots and releases it as vapor through their leaves, increasing atmospheric moisture, and even its cross-continental transport, which increases the likelihood of rain and water yield, in particular in the continental interiors further from the ocean, and especially in the summertime, just when we need it most for agriculture. But forestry, it's far from the main culprit when we talk about the loss of forest evapotranspiration. No, at least here in Canada, forestry companies, they need to replant what they cut. Not that there's not a severe impact from the industry, but there's a much more sinister driver pushing deforestation across the world, which scientists are more and more associating with drought, both now and historically, and that's agriculture. 45% of the Earth's ice and desert-free land surface, our habitable land, is used for agriculture. There's nearly 3 times as much land dedicated to livestock than there are natural grasslands and shrublands left in this world. About as much land for livestock as there are forests. In fact, agricultural expansion is the primary driver of forest loss globally. We've lost 1/3 of Earth's forests and 70% of our grasslands and shrublands to agriculture. And we continue to deforest about 5 million hectares of tree habitat each year globally, over 6 million hectares in 2022, displacing indigenous communities, committing cultural genocide along the way, about 75% of which is driven by agriculture, and the lion's share of that is for pasture and animal feed crops. For example, palm oil gets a lot of attention for clearing 9 million hectares of forest between 2001 and 2015. Over 45 million hectares were cleared for pasture alone, more than palm oil, coffee, cocoa, and soy combined over that same period. In North America, millions of hectares have been cleared for agriculture as well, much of which is carved out from old growth forests. The permanent removal of trees not only impacts our water cycle, it contributes to biodiversity loss and, of course, climate change, taking our precious carbon sink ecosystems that sequesters carbon, and transforming them into carbon sources, ecosystems that emit carbon. And climate change, in turn, is driving more water scarcity. 2 papers independently came to similar results in 2021 and 2022, finding that the opportunity cost of land use change has been greatly underestimated. They pointed out that if we were to rewild all the lands dedicated to animal agriculture and go plant-based, we could potentially sequester 15 years worth of greenhouse gas emissions over the next 30, stabilizing our climate during that period to give us the time needed to make a meaningful transition to a low-carbon society, an opportunity our world leaders are currently turning a blind eye to. So we clear a lot of land for pasture. Pasture is typically land that was converted to pasture from forest or other ecosystems, or they're grasslands, some of the most beautiful, threatened, misunderstood, and ecologically valuable ecosystems on the planet, a resource heavily exploited in North America. In the mid to late 1800s, beef production really started to grow here in BC, partly in response to the gold rush. And it just so happened that this is when we began developing and geographically placing Indian reserves. A really great book that details this history, in my area at least, is Resettling the Range by John Thistle, published in the UBC Academic Press. As they were surveying the lands, they were evaluating it economically. Of course, agriculture was a priority, and in much of the province, Indian reserves were geographically located with that in mind, placing them in less economical areas. Cattle require a lot of land and good forage, in other words, prime wildlife habitat, land that was otherwise considered home by indigenous nations. And in the rush to prioritize pasture land, reserves were cast off into areas with poor forage, where indigenous communities protested that there was not even enough grass for their horses managed by indigenous communities, horses which were later killed by settlers as they competed with cattle for grass. The exploitation of our grasslands was so mishandled that only decades after the introduction of cattle in my province, 90% of the grasslands in the southern interior were overgrazed. The area in the early 1900s was likened to a dust bowl. Locusts, poison traps, and the loss of predators and other wildlife driven by overgrazing and livestock management sharply altered the watersheds that they now characterize. This was perhaps the first great land grab here, changing landscapes, displacing indigenous peoples into marginal lands across North America to make way for ranches and other agricultural and economic endeavors. A couple years ago, I attended the annual grand meeting for British Columbian professional agrologists. I was on the planning committee, and we hired an Indigenous speaker to open the day and give us a short speech. And after the speech, an agrologist asked her about native food plants. And initially, she was happy to speak to us about it. She talked about how important the Indian potato is for her nation and told us about how she used to harvest it as a girl. Then she paused and said, "But there's no more Indian potato where the livestock graze." The potato-like corm, a tuber, was said that when traditionally cultivated would grow to the size of a fist. You know, I discussed this story with agrologists who said, well, Indigenous people, they always say that kind of thing. Darn. Grazing livestock, almost ubiquitous across the North American landscape, do change plant communities. And on pasture, traditional food and medicinal plants are disappearing from the grasslands in response to cattle's manipulation of ecosystems. Cattle replaced bison in the Great Plains, which were integral to many Indigenous identities. Bison were considered a savage's livestock, and replacing them with cattle would civilize North America. U.S. Army Colonel Richard Irving Dodge famously said, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone," literally overnight. This was part of a process of turning the new world into the old world, not just assimilating Indigenous peoples, but also the lands that they inhabit. They claim that cattle mimic bison on the landscape, providing the ecological service of grazing. However, cattle behave differently than bison. They tend to congregate in riparian areas, the interface between land and rivers or streams, causing erosion and vegetation loss, negatively impacting fish habitat. Whereas bison, they don't do that. They also influence plant communities differently. In his book, Aldo Leopold in the Sand County Almanac, 1949, he talked about this impact on plant communities. He talked about how the silphium plant, a yellow flower, won't grow where cattle graze. He said that they'll grow where dirt roads are, where bison graze, but not where cattle graze. He thought that this was because bison would migrate. They may intensely graze one area, but then they move on, migrating vast distances, not returning for a long while. Whereas cattle, they're enclosed within boundaries, concentrated, fenced in, continually ravaging the same environment over and over. An Indigenous colleague once told me about how he and his father used to hunt for grouse and ptarmigan in the grasslands. The grasslands would be rustling with ground birds, he said, a lively place, but not so much anymore. Lower grass heights and grazing intensity is known to negatively impact ground bird nesting. However, his grandfather, he said, would talk about flocks of ptarmigan and grouse in the grasslands in greater numbers than he ever knew. So I told this story to natural resource professionals and agrologists and was met with yet again, Indigenous people, they always say that kind of thing, or there's no evidence for that. This vile norm towards Indigenous knowledge within professional circles is regressive, reminiscent of eras past. This is 2024. Such attitudes no longer should have a rightful sway over land stewardship. Well, after this story was shared with me, I read The Condor Shadow by one of my heroes, an ecologist, David S. Wilkove. He tells a story about when he was a kid starting his birdwatching adventures. The old timers would always say that the spring migration just wasn't what it used to be. At first, he chalked this up to old age, memory loss, eyesight. He didn't really believe it. But 30 years later, he found himself saying the same thing, that the spring migration just wasn't what it used to be. Now, the kids starting their birdwatching adventures today will never know what it was like when he was a kid, and he will never know what it was like when the old timers were kids. He calls this kind of generational amnesia perhaps the greatest impediment to a lasting conservation ethic in America today. But nobody said oh, ecologists, they always say that kind of thing, or, oh, there's no evidence for that. No, David S. Wilcove, he got a Pioneer of Science Award. He got a Publication of the Year Award, among many others. He's a treasured scientist. Now, I offer this reflection because I believe we've lost our point of reference. Amidst our rapid pace, we often overlook the wisdom of those who've witnessed subtle shifts of time, our elders. Each incremental disturbance to ecosystems justified by isolated impacts overlooks the potential for cumulative effects with unforeseen repercussions. Once an Indigenous colleague inquired about where I'm from, yet having lived in many places, the questions seem almost inconsequential. My roots are scattered. He said that my perspective of the land is fleeting, contrasting it with the ancestral wisdom spanning millennia. Generations upon generations have nurtured a profound understanding of the land's essence, a legacy that eludes my transient grasp. I intuitively accept the state of the land as I encounter it. My perception shaped by fleeting encounters rather than enduring heritage. This is my natural point of reference. Some have referred to this phenomenon as shifting baseline syndrome. This phenomenon, shifting baseline syndrome, ensnares each generation as they gradually accept the current state of their environment as the new norm. With the ongoing degradation of our natural world, this leads to a perpetual lowering of our standards for ecological health, which results in inappropriate baselines that are employed for the conservation, restoration, and management of nature, exacerbating the continuing degradation of the natural world. Let's change that. E.O. Wilson once said that only by committing half of the planet's surface to nature can we hope to save the immensity of life forms that compose it. Unless humanity learns a great deal more about biodiversity loss and moves quickly to protect it, we will soon lose most of the species composing life on Earth. With half of the planet dedicated to agriculture, this would be impossible unless we take action. Reconciliation, learning, understanding, and action. We have the opportunity through our diets to reduce the amount of land used by agriculture by 75%, an area the size of North America and Brazil combined. The opportunities would be incredible. But for the sake of time, maybe I'll end quickly with this. Aldo Leopold once said, "I'm glad I will not be young in a future without wilderness." And forgive my characterization of wilderness in this talk. What we call wild, Indigenous nations may have just called home. Our idea of wild is a Western social construct, but this is the future big meat may instill in our trajectory. What we think of as nature is always a step further away, less accessible for the general public, becoming more and more distant from our sense of place and our cultural sphere, where wildlife becomes simplified, an ecology of rats, ticks, cockroaches, malaria, pigeons, raccoons, starlings, and house finches. Although Leopold, he said a lot of things. He said that to receive an education in ecology is to live alone in a world full of wounds. And although we still live in a world full of wounds, we're no longer alone. As we come together here at the vegan convergence of the people, reconciling with our past means learning, understanding, and moving forward in unity to mend those wounds together. So that's it for my presentation. If we have time for any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Cory. That was such an incredible presentation packed with so much passion and information. And wow, thank you. That will be a presentation worthy of watching and listening and sharing many times over. Really appreciate that. Any questions? Maybe you could raise your hand if you want to ask personally. Are there any questions in the chat? Yeah, Race's gorgeous, beautiful slides, Cory. Brilliant.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks. I should note here in Canada, I talked about water consumption. Now they don't provide data. Statistics Canada doesn't provide data on water consumption, only water use. And so you might see some difference. Industry is the lead driver of water use, but that includes using water for turbines and then returning that water back to the natural environment, its original source. And so that's a different from water consumption, where you take the water out and it never returns to its original source. So if you're confused by some of the data that's out there on water use, that's perhaps why.
Right. I see Beth. Great. Can you allow Beth to unmute, Rebecca?
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I just have a question about, like, how did you get so passionate both about the environment, and also I really sensed your passion for justice for Indigenous people. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, you bet. I've been passionate about the environment from an early age, recognizing that it impacts people. I remember being quite young, maybe 12 or 13 years old, and I used to go exploring on Knox Mountain in Kelowna. And one day after I came back from the Compassion for Animals road expedition, I was gone for about 8 months. I came back and I was I found this really special place. Knox Mountain is really dry. And there was this natural pond that existed there, where amongst the dry shrubland around it, there was this lush green patch. And there was this pond there. And I used to just always go there whenever I was stressed out or anything. And I just sit there and enjoy nature. Well, one day I was walking along, and there was a road blocking the trail. And when I walked on them, there was security cameras on the road already. And they were building a subdivision, a really rich subdivision. So they were an NHL hockey player lives in one of those mansions now. And a security guard drove up really quickly and stopped me and said, "You're not allowed here." And I could never find that pond again. It was gone. And, that connection to nature, I guess, really motivated me throughout my life and career. And having looked at the environmental impacts of food from an early age, I think just fostered that worldview in me. And I've been working with Indigenous peoples for quite a long time, for about 10 years in the environmental realm all across British Columbia. I also just got back from the Marshall Islands in Micronesia. 18 years I went there with my mom, and we built out a diabetes wellness center, sourced local foods, things like that. Marshall Islands was colonized in the 1500s by the Spanish, right? Similar to North America. And then the Spanish sold it to the Germans in the 1800s before Japan took over it in World War I. And then the United States stole it from Japan in World War II, where they tested over 100 nuclear devices, one 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima, displacing the people of the Bikini Atolls. And so I went there recently for a couple of weeks, gave a presentation to the president of the Marshall Islands on climate change and the Attorney General, but working with the vibrant, energetic people of the Marshall Islands also inspires me, because it's not just North America, it's a global issue.
Thank you very much. Oops.
I see another hand up there.
And there's some questions in the chat, Tammy.
Okay. So here we go. Can you unmute?
Okay, I think you can hear me.
There we
That
go.
was a wonderful presentation. I had a special question about what you said about that if there are more trees, that they will increase the precipitation. It would be very nice if it could be in the Amazon. Also, if you cut it down, if you get more trees there, then would also precipitation would increase. Do you have any reference for that? Which is you?
Yeah, actually, there's quite a bit of literature on evapotranspiration. It's something that's emerging in the consciousness of the scientific literature today. But if you want real-time examples, well, the Amazon is a really great example because the deforestation is directly linked to a lot of the drought that's occurring locally in the Amazon. But it's only now, like, the emerging science about how it increases atmospheric moisture and the cross-continental transport of that moisture. And so you can look on Google. There are some free papers on it. I don't have any handy in front of me, but the information's out there and readily available. So I'd encourage people to check that out.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
I'm losing a little bit of it. Thank you, Cory. Oh, did we lose someone here? Are we okay? Okay. There's another question from Lee. It says, are any of these presentations available for later viewing? And yes, they are on our Trello board, but also Cory probably would be happy to share if you have a community that is looking for a presentation as well. Would that be possible down the road, Cory?
I would be thrilled to give
contact
this presentation or another one. You could check out my websites, corydavis.ca, I believe, and plant-poweredprotein.com, or you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn as well, and or maybe through. Oh, thank you, Cory Davis. Let's see. I'll just quickly pull up my website. Sorry, it's on the tip of my tongue, but
Thank you, Cory.
Yeah, corydavis.ca is it.
And Cory Davis and his mother's latest book, Plant-Powered Protein, is gorgeous, and it's full of story, and it's just a really beautiful, beautiful book if you're looking for something amazing. Lisa asked, what is the term for subsequent generations using what they know as a measurement of what to preserve? And
Yeah.
Paul kind of, is it stable baseline?
Shifting baseline syndrome. And I also like the way David S. Wilkove characterizes a similar phenomenon called generational amnesia. And both concepts have peer-reviewed literature freely available on Google Scholar if you're interested to dive in a bit more.
I think that's complete for the questions. What was Cory's other site? Oh, okay. What was your other site?
Plant-poweredprotein.com. That's our book, and you could get a hold of the authors through there as well.
I see that Ray has put that in the chat as well. And
Wonderful.
yes, Brenda Davis is his mom, and that was the reading I did before was on Brenda and Cory's father. What's his first name again? Cory, your father?
Yeah. My father, he's just been an enormous influence on my life because he's so sensitive towards the environment and instilled that value in me from a very young age, getting me in touch with nature, taking me canoeing and hiking. I wouldn't be the same person if it wasn't for that influence, that's for sure.
Thank you so much, Cory, for being here. Any final words?
Be the change you want to see. I hope, each one of us would perhaps struggle to create influence, but I think we create a lot of influence within our community, our sphere of influence with our friends and everything, and just being a humble person, sharing good food with others, I think has a profound impact. And doing that really allows us to align our behaviors with our values. And I just think, gosh, that's so spiritually fulfilling to behave in a way that aligns with our values. And I hope we can share that with our friends and family.
Thank you so much, Cory. It's brilliant, brilliant presentation. Gorgeous art. Gorgeous art. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Such a pleasure to see you guys.